recognizes Mr. Green from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank the members of the Rules Committee for allowing us this opportunity. I also thank the many persons who work with you, the staff. I want you to know, Mr. Chairman, that they do an outstanding job, and I greatly appreciate the way they have helped us to negotiate the system. Mr. Chairman, I have several amendments, and because I am told that brevity is not a liability, I shall be as pithy and concise as possible. The first amendment is the Real Property Preemption Amendment. Mr. Chairman, this amendment would deal with some 30 or more states that are currently crafting laws that will prohibit persons from purchasing property based upon citizenship. While this might seem innocuous, Mr. Chairman, some of these laws could create international conflicts. We do not believe that states should be in the business of determining whether or not persons can purchase property based upon citizenship. My hope is, my prayer is, that we can preempt this activity such that states cannot perform this function and allow this to be in the hands of the Committee on Foreign Investments in the United States. There may be a need to give the committee some additional authority to do this, but I believe that it would be far better to preempt than to allow some 30 states to have this patchwork, if you will, of laws that preempt persons from purchasing property based upon citizenship. Finally, on this point, I do believe that there are times when we want to prohibit persons from purchasing property in certain places near our military facilities. Obviously, that could be of concern, and there are other facilities as well. I just don't believe that we ought to have 30 states, perhaps as many as 50 in the final analysis, to engage in this type of conduct. The next piece of legislation will be the renal medullary carcinoma legislation, Mr. Chairman, something that you have a great deal of knowledge about. The Byron-Nash renal medullary carcinoma bill is one that sort of touches my heart. I knew the young man, African American. I mention his ethnicity, his race, only because this disease is deadly, and it seems to strike persons who are of African ancestry who have the sickle cell trait. This young man, when it was discovered that he had this dreadful, deadly disease, it was too late to save his life. And the disease is very difficult to recognize. Even the best physicians can miss this disease and not properly diagnose. It's my opinion that we can spend a very small amount of money to accord states such that they will match and will give doctors the additional information that they need to diagnose properly this disease and save lives. Again, it's a little bit personal. I knew the young man. He had a decent future ahead of him, but it was snatched away from him because of renal medullary carcinoma. The next piece of legislation is the residential loan question for veterans. I'm not a veteran, and in a sense, I sense that I have a debt that I owe. People who are willing to go to distant places, put their lives on the line, many of them don't return, and many of those that do return don't return the way they left. I was in a distant place a while ago, Mr. Chairman, and I looked over my right shoulder. I was literally lost. And I saw a sign that said, "Come in and see the price of freedom." It dealt with veterans. It was a VA hospital. You want to see the cost of freedom, the price of freedom, go to a VA hospital. I have great respect for veterans. This is a very simple and a very beneficial piece of legislation that would require on the residential loan application a placement of the fact that a person is a veteran above the signature line, such that a veteran before signing would be aware of the fact that you can check this, and in so doing, make yourself available to opportunities that you might miss simply because it is not known that you are a veteran applying for this loan. This would help the many people who are willing to put their lives on the line for us to simply move this question above the signature line so that a veteran would see it, would check it, and could receive the benefits afforded veterans simply because of what they do and who they are. The next piece of legislation is the merchant mariners legislation. Mr. Chairman, merchant mariners have not been treated fairly by our country. Merchant mariners were involved in World War II. They were persons who provided the goods, transported them across the ocean to our personnel. They transported personnel. Many of them died. On a per capita basis, no branch of the military exceeded the death of the merchant mariners. The merchant mariners were not accorded the privileges that our other service members were accorded until 1987. 1987 for World War II. And the GI Bill, which afforded persons the opportunity to get a college education or go to a vocational school, they didn't get the benefit of that. They didn't get the benefit of loans for homes. These are people who put their lives on the line. Thousands of them died, approximately 250,000 served. Mr. Chairman, we really should honor them by according them a one-time payment of $25,000 to do what we intended to do but could not do because of our not being timely in according them the benefits that others received. Most of these persons now are in their 90s. They're in the twilight of life. They've paid their dues, and they've come to Washington, D.C. to petition the country that they served, requesting that they be given this small amount of money compared to the many amounts of money that we spend. I don't mean to say to anybody that $25,000 is something that should be considered trivial. But I do say that we should afford them this amount of money because of the services that they rendered and the fact that they were risking their lives, and because we intended to help them. It's just that we passed the legislation, or the opportunity to help them did not afford itself until 1987. Moving on to the military recruitment study. I've heard many persons talk about the military and how persons are treated and should be treated, should not be treated. This is really not about that. This is about ascertaining who's serving, to what extent, and whether or not one segment of our society may be shouldering a disproportionate share of the burden of service. I think it's good to know these things. If you know these things, you can make the adjustments necessary to assure us that service, which is something that's necessary, wouldn't want to have a country without a military, to be quite candid with you, not in the world that I live in. But to assure us that the burden of service is being borne fairly by all within the country. The next piece of legislation is the Homes for Heroes legislation. I think that when we who have the preeminent privilege of making decisions about housing for veterans, I think that when we make these decisions, having this great privilege and opportunity, we should consider the condition of veterans. We should consider those folk who sleep under bridges, those people who live in the streets of life, who've made great sacrifice so that we can have liberty and justice for all. It ought to tear at your heart to see a veteran standing on a corner under a bridge, pleading for help, homeless. This is the richest country in the world. This is something that we should not tolerate. And I believe that when our various housing agencies are making these decisions about housing, that the condition of our veterans should be considered. They should be given opportunities to move from the streets of life to a place that they can call home. And we should do more to get that done. I know that we've done a lot. I don't deny that we have done much, but there's much more to be done. And if we would simply require that these agencies that deal with housing, that they give consideration to the condition of our veterans when they're making their decisions, I believe that much more can be done. Finally, the Disaster Management Office Disaster Recovery Bill, CDBGDR. We know that we will have disasters. It's just a matter of time. It will happen. I think it appropriate, and I believe so to the extent that I've sponsored legislation that quite frankly passed the House once but did not pass the Senate. Legislation that would help us to somewhat streamline this process, but more importantly, legislation that would allow us to fund an entity within the government that would have this responsibility of dealing with these disaster release funds. It's a complicated concern, complicated problem, complicated issue, complicated because currently we're in the business of reinventing the wheel for each disaster. That can work well if you have the institutional knowledge available to you to continue the process in an efficacious fashion. The unfortunate circumstance is that we lose institutional knowledge. Be great if we could codify these necessities and to have an agency, an entity within the government that would manage these monies so that we can make sure that everybody who is in need will have some portion of that need satiated. Mr. Chairman, I was as brief as I could be given the the circumstance that I had to deal with. But I thank you for your smile, Mr. Chairman, and I will yield to my capable, competent, and qualified colleagues on the panel.